Greetings. I've decided to record a series of videos on the history of the development of the game of chess. I don't want to give a lot of detailed history or extensive biography. I'll just give a little as I go along. I'm mainly concerned with the games themselves. I'll start with the earliest and move forward, from Lucena to Greco to Philidor to MacDonald and de la Bourdonnais to Anderson and at last to Morphy. That's where the series will probably turn into something more like a classic games series. At any rate, we really don't have all that many games to look at before we get to Greco, but there are a few. I'm going to begin this series of games with a game found in the poem Scachs d'Amour, translatable as Chess Game of Love, written in 1475, one of only 3 games I know of from before 1500 whose records still survive. 3 Spaniards from Valencia composed the poem in Catalan, which Valencians themselves label Valencian, a language similar to Spanish. The 3 authors were, and I hope I don't mangle the pronunciation of their names too badly, Don Francis de Castelvi, Narcís Vinyoles, and Mossèn Bernat de Fenollar. In the poem, which is a discourse and debate on love, the first of the 3 takes the role of white, red in the poem. The second of them takes the role of black, green in the poem, and the third takes the role of arbiter, explaining the rules and the play as the game proceeds. Whether the game is an actual game, with the poem composed to fit it, or whether the game is a composition created in the writing of the poem itself so as to be suited to an explanation of the rules and of the playing of chess, I do not know, although I suspect it's composed. I'm interested in the game itself, as the oldest known recorded game of chess using the modern rules for the moves of the queen and bishop. As there are opportunities to castle that are not taken, I suspect that the modern rules of castling had not yet been adopted at the time. The modern rules of castling were adopted at different times in different places and did not become standardized throughout Europe until sometime in the 19th century. Had the rules of castling been established at the time and place of the poem's composition, I should think that the game would have been composed or selected so as to illustrate castling, for the character of the arbiter in the poem to have explained. Regardless of what the castling rules might or might not have been, I can't tell what they were. Here is the game from 1475. And as usual, when I show a game uh, on YouTube, it's using chess.com's analysis board and the Stockfish chess engine. The game began with e4, and we quickly saw a Scandinavian defense, also called the center counter defense. This is the first known appearance of the Scandinavian defense. Its second, as far as I can tell, is not until well into the 1800s. White took and black recaptured, and then white moved his queen's knight out, developing the knight and simultaneously gaining a tempo by attacking the black queen, as is still standard today. The queen could move over to a5, the queen could move back to d8, and more recently, queen to d6 has become popular. But those are the 3 normal moves. And in this game, black simply moved all the way back. White developed a bishop, black developed a knight, white developed a second knight, black developed a bishop. But although it looks like a normal developing move and pins the knight against the queen, still it's a mistake. And it's punishable in either of 2 ways. The first way is by bishop takes pawn check. And when the king takes, then knight to e5 check, forking the king and the bishop. And the king can move, say, to g8, and then white gets back his piece. And white has won a pawn. He's given black an isolated e-pawn. He's given black a hole on his king side. Black can't castle, and this rook is going to have a little trouble getting out. White's better. That's the first of the two ways to punish this move, bishop to g4. The second way is one that Stockfish actually prefers, and that's knight to e5 immediately. Black can't take the queen because of checkmate. He can't move the bishop back to defend f7 because the white queen will simply take the bishop. And if black takes the queen, then checkmate. So all black can do is move his bishop back to e6, and after the trade of bishops, and then white, say, castles, white hasn't won a pawn, but he's given black doubled isolated e-pawns. The one in front is surely a target. There's a hole in black's king side. White has a nice lead in development. And Stockfish likes this better than punishing the bishop move by bishop takes pawn check. But white in this game did not punish that move. He instead simply put the question to the bishop with h3. So, take the knight, retreat. The question has been put to the bishop, and the bishop took, queen recaptured, attacking the b7 pawn. Black decided to allow that. He played e6, giving his dark squared bishop a nice diagonal to develop along. White went ahead and took the pawn. But black didn't let white have the rook. Instead, he played knight b d7, so that his queen now defends the rook. And white then played knight to b5, threatening to take the pawn, but not only to take the pawn, but to take it with check and to fork the king and the rook, so he'd win the rook. Black should have defended with bishop to d6. Instead, he played rook to c8. So the knight took the a7 pawn. So now white's up 2 pawns. White was up 2 pawns at that point, and threatening to take the rook, threatening to win a rook. Rather than play rook to b8, which is what you might expect black to play. By the way, a nice point of this is, let's say black does this. So I have to make it white's move again. Okay, so now it's white's move. The knight will also be trapping the queen, which can't go to e7 because that's controlled too. So there's a bit of a threat that way too. Still, you might expect rook to b8 because that attacks the white queen, and I have to stop that black. There we go. You might expect rook to b8 attacking the white queen. But black instead played knight to b6, which defends the rook, and now there's no threat of trapping the queen. But white takes the rook and black recaptures. Now, white's just won an exchange, and he's also up 2 pawns. But it may very well be that nobody back then realized that rooks were worth more than knights. I rather suspect that back then it was just thought that, oh, well, rooks and knights are their pieces. You trade a rook for a knight, that's a trade of pieces. Okay. So I suspect that nobody actually realized that the rook was better, but I don't know. So white's now up in exchange in 2 pawns, and he plays d4. And that's not actually offering black a pawn because the queen's needed back on the last rank defending that knight. He can't take or lose the knight. Black played knight to d6, forking the white queen and bishop. Here, white could have played queen to c6 check, and then if black blocked with the knight, retreated his bishop to b6 or to b3 or to d3, one or the other. And that way, he would have preserved his 2 bishops. However, white didn't do that. White played bishop to b5 check, allowing a piece trade, giving up a bishop for a knight. Of course, I also doubt that anybody back then thought that bishops were at all better than knights. Now I think bishops are a shade better. But remember, up until very recently, chess books gave evaluations of the point values of the pieces as 3.0 for both. They just gave 3 points for the bishop and for the knight. They're just considered equivalent. So I can hardly blame white here for not bothering to save his bishop pair. Also, white's up in exchange in 2 pawns. He can afford to trade pieces, even if it is losing a bishop for a knight. It gets him closer to a completely winning endgame. Now, had black chosen to block with the queen, then yeah, we'd be headed for a nice, completely won endgame for white. But black didn't block with the queen. He blocked with a knight. Okay. And then white played boldly, d5, strong play, trying to rip open the e file to get at black's king. Good. And black took. That opens up the e file. So now I'm going to expect white to put a rook on the e file, start attacking. Doesn't actually happen in the game. White played bishop to e3 here, which I think is an inaccuracy, and which Stockfish also thinks is an inaccuracy. I think it's an inaccuracy because it puts the bishop on the e file. So if white does put a rook on e1 to attack along the e file, the bishop will be in its way. That's why I think it's an inaccuracy. I don't know why Stockfish thinks it is. When I play several moves ahead, Stockfish never does put the rook on e1. Eventually, what Stockfish does is start pushing this passed pawn, which is understandable. But I don't see why that makes bishop to e3 an inaccuracy. Anyway, it is only an inaccuracy. White's still winning easily. Black develops his bishop. White slides his rook over to d1, and that's a move that makes me think that the castling rules probably were not yet established in this part of Spain at this time. Because white could just as easily have castled queenside and gotten that rook onto the d file, while also vacating e1 for the other rook. So that looks good, but white didn't do that. Instead, he just directly moved his rook to d1. Now, I would expect black to castle here in order to break the pin of the knight, in order to get the king off of the e file, and in order to get this rook into play. Instead, black played queen to f6. White took the d pawn with his rook, and although he's still winning, he's allowing a fork, c6. A fork of the queen and the rook. White can't get out of it with check because either the knight or the bishop will take the queen. So that won't work. White can't get out of it by taking the pawn because of that check discovering an attack on the white queen. Once white gets out of check, black will take the defenseless white queen. So white can't get out of check. White can't get out of the fork by taking the pawn. Well, what can he do? Well, what he can do is take the bishop with his rook. And then if pawn takes queen, rook takes queen, knight takes rook. And at this point, we are in an endgame, and it is a winning endgame for white. Rook for each player, minor piece for each player, pawn island on the king side of 3 connected pawns for each side. But white has a 3-on-1 pawn majority on the queen side. That should suffice to win. Moreover, white has a bishop rather than a knight. Now, there are pawns on both sides of the board. With pawns on both sides of the board, you'd probably rather have the bishop because the bishop can get from side to side quickly. The knight can't. So you'd probably rather have the bishop. So white has an extra 2 pawns on the queen side. He has the bishop against the knight. I think white should win this. White should definitely win this. Now, go back a bit. If white does play rook takes bishop, black doesn't have to take the queen. Stockfish thinks it's best, but that doesn't mean black has to do it. Black could play queen takes rook. And then maybe white will play queen c4, maybe, and the game will continue. And yes, white's still up and exchanging 2 pawns, but with the queens on the board, it's a bit more complicated. Black can try to make complications, make more attacks, and just make it harder for white to win. Still, white would be winning. So that c6 move of black's doesn't actually turn the game around for him. Still, personally, I would not like to have permitted that c6 fork. But black didn't fork. Instead, he moved his queen to g6, attacking g2 and attacking c2. And I'd be more afraid of this one because from there the queen would attack the rook. White then set a trap with bishop to f4. And I want to say a word about traps. In general, you should try to make the best moves. And you should assume that your opponent's going to make good moves. You shouldn't just assume that your opponent will fall into whatever trap you set. And if you have a really good move, but you decide to make a move that's not as good, but that sets a trap, yeah, probably not the right thing to do. You should probably try to make the better move rather than the trappy move. You shouldn't just play on hope that your opponent will make a mistake and fall into your trap. No, you should try to make the best moves. This sort of trappy move probably isn't best. And you probably shouldn't play for traps. Now, obviously, if you have a good move you can make that also sets a trap, well, okay, that's fine. But in general, you shouldn't play for traps. You should try to find good moves. There's one exception. That's if you've already played badly and you've already got a lost position. Maybe you're down in exchange and a couple of pawns, and you have no hope of winning. You have no compensation. Your opponent is just, destroying you. He's winning. If the game, maybe you can last another 20 or 30 moves, but it's obvious, it's clear that your opponent will win the game if he plays reasonable chess. Well then, yes, okay, that's the time. That's the time to set traps if you can, even if they're not your best moves. Because unless your opponent plays really badly, you're going to lose. But he's more apt to make a big mistake if you set it, if you set a trap. If he falls into a trap, he's more likely to make a big mistake that way than any other way. So, okay, if you've gotten yourself into a losing position, just I don't mean a position where you're down a little bit, where your opponent has a bit of a better position. That's not what I mean. In that kind of position, you fight back, and you fight back hard. You do everything you can to make it hard for your opponent to win. You do everything you can to try to generate play for yourself, and you don't just set some bad trap that if your opponent avoids it, he can just kill you. No. But if you're just completely lost, you just have a lost game. But you can set traps. Well, okay, then that's the time to set traps. Just for the sake of setting traps. So here, white set this trap. He played bishop to f4. And black should just go ahead and play this move. Now he's attacking the rook. And if the rook slides over to f1, saving the rook, then queen here check, which attacks the bishop, attacks the king, right? And white can't just come back here so that there's a mutual pin of queens, that won't work. That won't work. Black can trade queens and then take the free bishop. And if you look at the material here, white has a rook and a pawn for 2 pieces. Well, that's not winning. In fact, if you look at Stockfish's evaluation, Stockfish says that black's a tiny bit better, just a shade better. That's not a win. No. So you can't do that. You can't play that queen e2 move. Instead, you're going to have to save your bishop. Well, so much for your trap. So much for your trap. So you've lost a pawn. And the game will continue. And yeah, white's still winning. But white's making it harder himself. Much harder than he needs to. But black didn't take on g2. He didn't punish that bishop to f4 move, that trap setting move. You should notice that if white takes here, then the king can take because the bishop's in the way, right? The rook, it blocks the rook's access to d7. But once black falls into the trap, takes what looks like a free piece, well, okay, now white can take that knight. He has a mate in two. Check. And mate. And there you go. So we'll play through it again just quickly. E4, D5, Scandinavian defense. Wow. White takes, black takes, knight to C3, attacking the queen. The queen just goes straight back. We get some development. Bad development here, but it goes unpunished. It goes unpunished. White instead simply puts the question to the bishop, kicks the bishop. The bishop takes, the queen takes, and then black lets white take the b7 pawn, but not the rook on a8. White threatens the fork on c7, overcomes the rook, but that allows white to win another pawn. And then black simply defends the rook. Maybe at that time, rooks and knights were thought to be equal in value. I don't know. White picks up a rook for a knight, so he's up in exchange and a pawn. That does not give away a pawn. The queen can't take because then he loses the c8 knight. Fork of the queen and the bishop. And rather than check on c6 with the queen and then preserve his bishop pair by retreating his bishop, white simply gives check with the bishop and allows a piece trade, which gets white closer to a winning endgame. But black doesn't trade queens, so we're still a little bit of distance from a winning ending for white. White plays d5, trying to rip open black's king position, trying to rip open that e file, and black takes. And then oddly enough, white doesn't take the e file. Plays bishop to e3, blocking the e file. And then rook to d1, he doesn't castle queenside, so I really seriously wonder if castling was yet established at that time and that place in 1475 in Valencia. Black moves the queen out, not castling. White takes on d5, allowing the c6 fork, but black doesn't take the bait. Black doesn't go ahead and fork. And white sets a trap. And rather than take on g2, black takes what looks like a free bishop and promptly gets mated. And that is the game. That's the game. So that's chess in 1475, at least as recorded in a poem. It's clearly not a grandmaster caliber game, but on the other hand, it's not a bad game for the earliest known recorded game of chess. Next time, I'll look at one of the other 2 recorded games of chess that I know of from before 1500. A 1497 game played by Luthena. As always, try to win, or try to play well.